Hello, I'm Andrew Bartnowak, and today I'm going to be talking about the influences of human trafficking from an integrative approach. Before we begin, a little background overview about human trafficking. Human trafficking is something that's been occurring throughout society for centuries. It's been probably referred to as different names throughout time, but it's important to remember that human trafficking is not just limited to one aspect or one area. There are many different variables that make up what human trafficking is. For example, human trafficking could be people being forced against their will for labor. Again, the one everyone's probably very familiar with is the human trafficking aspect of those who have either been kidnapped or forced into prostitution or some sort of sexual engagement. So, with that said, the idea of this research was to try and get a better understanding on what aspects, what different things influence human trafficking from the perspective of the victims, as well as the perpetrators of human trafficking. What are different things that occur that influence the engagement of human trafficking. Before I go in further, there's very limited resources out there pertaining to the study and research on what influences human trafficking from the perpetrator's perspective. So while that was my goal of this assignment, again, there was very limited research that has been conducted in regards to that aspect. Now, with that said, human trafficking is a very complex issue because of the different variables and aspects that go into what defines human trafficking, as previously mentioned. One of the important parts of understanding the influence of human trafficking comes to two different disciplines, and with trying to understand the influence, I found that the two best disciplines for understanding the influence of human trafficking were those of psychology and sociology. Now, the reason why I chose psychology is because in order to understand the different influences with regards to human trafficking, understanding the different psychological aspects that attribute to this issue provides an opportunity to combat human trafficking, as well as provides the proper services that can more effectively ensure the beneficial recovery and possible prevention for future individuals and potential victims. So, in order to develop this further understanding, the first step is to look at the different behavioral characteristics of human trafficking. The victims of human trafficking often share some similar and common characteristics of behavioral risk factors that make them a suitable target for these perpetrators of human trafficking. Some of these have been identified as child abuse, compromised parenting, negative mental health, or a negative view of one's own individual self. Child neglect seems to be one of the more common issues that we've been seeing, especially those who found themselves in foster care. Foster care children, at least in the U.S., according to a 2007 report by Logan, represented a high number of victims who represented a high number of future victims within human trafficking here in the United States. There's different aspects that contribute to that. Oftentimes, these children, and not just children, youth are mainly the main people who make up the main individuals that make up victims of human trafficking, and they're often found in areas of with high poverty rates, high criminal activity rates, or rates that there's a low police government enforcement in that area compared to areas that have high job opportunities, less crime rate, more of a police presence. And back to this Logan report from 2007 identified that oftentimes it was a desperation of hope from individuals who were living in these poverty-stricken societies that made them the most vulnerable. Being approached by a perpetrator of human trafficking more times than what we're led to believe. It's not somebody just being kidnapped and taken away and they wake up and they're in a dungeon or a prison. While that does happen, most of the times these victims are tricked into becoming victims of human trafficking, whether it's through hey, I got a opportunity for them to make money, for them to financially gain, for financial gains to benefit them or their families, and get them out of these poverty-stricken societies and areas that they live in. They go ahead and they believe these people, and sometimes these individuals who are identified as the perpetrators of human trafficking will give them some sort of incentive. They'll lead them on, maybe give them some money or some food for their family, and so that kind of builds that trust for these potential and future victims that, okay, well, I've done this so far and this is what I've benefited from this, so let me do the next step further. And oftentimes it's after that first initial encounter, or after they first receive this initial reward, if you will, is when they will be tricked into finding out that this person was lying, and now it's too late, and have somehow found themselves to be extorted as a victim of human trafficking, whether sexual, for forced labor. Again, this ranges. Another aspect, a psychological aspect that was found, is the use of drugs and the engagement of narcotics in individuals at an early age. Examining the perceptions of the traffickers' power and control among the victims from a 2019 report by Preble stated that the reason for some of these victims' compliant behaviors derives from the psychological aspect of dependence in these narcotics. And so a lot of times these victims will have either prior use of narcotics, or they will get hooked by the perpetrators. And so they kind of use that and have that leverage over these victims. If they want to continue to feed their habit, feed their addiction, they need to do these acts. They need to work for these perpetrators. And that is a very hard aspect to deal with, especially when somebody already has a pre-developed habit or addiction with narcotics. The other discipline that was examined was sociology. And while sociology and psychology are both social sciences, sociology, I believed, was the second best discipline to investigate in relation to understanding the influence of human trafficking, because it contributes to a further understanding around the social nature that occurs in all societies, while also examining the different various social human interactions within these societies where there's a high rate of human trafficking victims. Now, Schauer and Wheaton from a 2006 interview suggested one of the key sociological characteristics on the influence of human trafficking comes from those who live in vulnerable populations. Now, what exactly is a vulnerable population? Well, more specifically, these individuals that live in a disadvantaged society, suffering from high poverty, the high statistical crime rate. Individuals in these areas have been identified to be more at risk, more prone to becoming victims of human trafficking. The reason why is because in these areas where there's a lot of crime, a lot of unemployment, you find that there's more attention to the crime from the police on bigger issues, on shootings, on stabbings, on murders, on domestic disputes. And when there's already a lack of police presence, that means that them getting around to other issues such as child neglect or somebody ran away allows for human trafficking actions to not necessarily go unnoticed, but there's a higher priority, and that's why these perpetrators take advantage of societies and areas like these, is because they know that the way they go about finding their victims is not going to cause a lot of attention. It's not going to be reported as much as drug dealers down the street, or the shooting that just happened on the other side of town, or what's going on between two rival gangs. Those are the issues that primarily occupy the police presence in these areas. And these perpetrators of human trafficking understand this, and so they'll go about ways of kind of hiding in the shadows, if you will, of taking advantage of the lack of police presence, the lack of police acknowledgement, and using these to find their victims. Now, kind of similar with the psychological aspects in terms of prior narcotic use. Nicolescu, 2011 report found that traffickers target these areas, exploiting victims with very little resistance. Now, the number of victims that have engaged in narcotic addiction or narcotic use at a young age, 18 and younger, found out that the more frequent they engaged in these actions of using and consuming different narcotics or alcohol, 75% of the youth reported a second occurrence. So this continues to show that the more frequent they engage in buying and in consuming these narcotics, the higher percentage that they will have in becoming victims of commercially exploited sexual experiences or prostitution. Now, another sociological aspect that I think was very important to this was found in Wallinger's 2010 report, and that highlighted the importance of social media. Social media obviously has a very big influence throughout our country and societies throughout the world. And they found that there's a lot of underreported stories and information that has been going around. While many of these news agencies tend to focus on politics or on other different crime-related stories, if there were more of a exposure to the different aspects of human trafficking, Wallinger believes that would create a more understanding with the general population in our society on understanding what different variables contribute to someone becoming a potential victim, to what aspects that the perpetrators of human trafficking look for and try to find and take advantage of in societies where there's a high number of victims for human trafficking. And in return, the more knowledge, the more information that's spread throughout society in relation to human trafficking, the better chances we have at prevention and treating those who have already become victims of it. So, in conclusion with this report is that these different psychological and sociological aspects in relation to the influence of human trafficking, it comes down to understanding that there needs to be more information spread, whether that's through schools, through social media, through local and national news stations, and there needs to be more resources available. While there's police presence is vary and what cities and what problems they have from city to city across the nation, there needs to be a standard. There needs to be a solid resources available in communities, especially these communities that are targeted by these perpetrators of human trafficking, to allow whether it's narcotic and drug or alcohol addiction therapy, whether it's more therapy, more resources for children who are neglected, who have been exposed to violence or have been sexually abused as minors. There needs to be more of these resources available for our youth, and prevention training throughout schools and their educations to develop a further understanding of what these perpetrators look for, how we can combat this. And through doing that, I believe that there will be less victims of human trafficking in the future if we do this, and continue to further our understanding of psychological and sociological influences with regards to human trafficking. Thank you.